The fight over Donald Trump's immigration actions are only intensifying, with the Supreme Court and the administration now barreling towards what might become a full-blown constitutional crisis. Right? And so for you to fully understand where we are and where we're going, you have to first go back to Saturday when the Supreme Court issued an emergency order at like 1 o'clock in the morning to block the administration from deporting even more Venezuelans accused of being part of Tren de Aragua. Because you have the Trump administration using the controversial 1798 Alien Enemies Act to deport people that it claims are part of the gang. And notably, this act has only ever been used like 3 other times to go after people, and each time it's been a black stain on America's history. And this is normally a gang wouldn't be targeted under the act since it's meant to remove people working with enemy governments, which is why to justify its use, the Trump administration has accused them of being an operation by Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro. And with that, like we've talked about earlier this month, the administration began flying alleged gang members to El Salvador, with it obvious from the get-go that there's going to be a ton of litigation around this. And in fact, the Supreme Court stepped up in early April to essentially say, what the fuck are you doing? You need to give people that you want to deport enough time to challenge their deportations before removing them from the US. However, there were growing signs that the Trump administration was going to violate that ruling, or at least the spirit of it. Because this past Thursday, immigration officials started issuing notices to Venezuelans being held in a Texas detention center that read, I am a law enforcement officer authorized to apprehend, restrain, and remove alien enemies. Accordingly, under the Alien Enemies Act, you have been determined to be an alien enemy subject to apprehension, restraint, and removal from the United States. With critics then accusing the administration of violating the Supreme Court's order because A, the letter was only in English and many of the recipients don't speak English, and B, it was given out late Thursday night, meaning that they'd have just a few hours to get a hold of a lawyer and fight the case by Friday morning or risk getting deported over the weekend. And so what we saw was the ACLU springing into action and challenging the government's action. And while the reporting, I'll say, is a bit hazy here, it does seem like they initially tried to go to the district court before turning to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and then the Supreme Court for help. With then, at around 1 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, the Supreme Court stepping in with that extremely short order that essentially blocked the government from deporting these Venezuelans. And this is notably the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals actually denied the ACLU's request, claiming that they needed to wait for the district court to make a decision before intervening outside of crazy circumstances. With them saying that they didn't feel this was a crazy circumstance, claiming the district court's order today indicates that petitioners gave the court only 42 minutes to act and did not give respondents an opportunity to respond. And this reasoning was actually echoed later in the evening after Justices Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas released their dissent, with their argument pretty much being that this was an unprecedented move by the Supreme Court and was hastily and prematurely granted. And quote, in sum, literally in the middle of the night, the court issued unprecedented and legally questionable relief without giving the lower courts a chance to rule, without hearing from the opposing party within 8 hours of receiving the application, with dubious factual support for its order, and without providing any explanation for its order. Of course, as we talked about earlier, the court told the Trump administration it needed to give people ample time to challenge their deportations, and many feel that Alito's dissent ignores the reality that the government's actions arguably skirted that order, as well as the fact that the government is willing to move people very quickly. Not to mention that allegedly there were already Venezuelans on buses, presumably to be sent to airports when the ACLU made its motions. Also, I will say it's not like Alito was completely wrong in calling this unprecedented, with just one of the examples being this administrative stay was made by the entire court when normally they're done by a single justice who oversees that district court. In this case, the Fifth is Alito's territory. And considering he dissented, it's very likely that no stay would have been issued if it was his choice. I'll also say it's extremely unusual for the Supreme Court to issue its ruling before a dissent has been written, right? Normally they're released at the same time, but also considering that there were fears that people were going to get deported within hours, the court might have felt that they had to move super fast. But then notably, with all that, there is a growing narrative online among Trump supporters that the court is now overstepping its boundaries and should be ignored, with some even saying things like, so if the Supreme Court can overrule the executive branch, does that mean the executive branch can overrule Supreme Court decisions since they are both co-equal branches? And you've got conservative radio host Jesse Kelly arguing, ignore the Supreme Court, arrest anyone who tries to enforce this, dissolve the Supreme Court entirely if they push. You can deport foreigners or you don't have a country anymore. There are no good choices now. And this is just one of the potential constitutional crises going on. Right? I mean, another is the fight over due process, which underpins almost all of this, which the TLDR is that, people in America are afforded due process, which gives them a chance to fight their charges. Right? Due process, kind of important. Otherwise, the government says, hey, you're this thing, and that's it. You're that thing. And in this case, without those hearings, the government doesn't have to prove anything about the people that they're rounding up. They could just wave a magic wand and claim that someone's a Salvadoran MS-13 gang member, and therefore they need to be deported, such as in Kilmar Abrego Garcia's case. Just today, you had a federal judge in Colorado ruling that the Trump administration must give a 21-day notice to any Venezuelan migrants detained in the state before it can deport them, with the administration then also being required to tell those migrants in a language they understand that they have a right to challenge their deportation. With that, one of the things that we're seeing is that many Trump supporters are increasingly saying they don't think allegedly undocumented people should get that kind of due process. With, for example, last week, Vice President J.D. Vance tweeting out a defense of the administration's actions, writing, ask the people weeping over the lack of due process what precisely they propose for dealing with Biden's millions and millions of illegals. And with reasonable resources and administrative judge constraints, does their solution allow us to deport at least a few million people per year? Though with that, you've had many people pushing back saying that argument is essentially there's too many people to process fairly, so let's just skip the Constitution. And I mean, the fact that you have people calling for skipping due process, it set off alarm bells in people who otherwise support Trump, like Joe Rogan, for example, who's in this now viral clip saying,
What about due process? No, for that. Well, here's the problem with that. What if you are an enemy of, let's not say any current president. Let's pretend we got a new president, totally new guy in 2028. And this is a common practice now of just rounding up gang members with no due process and shipping them to El Salvador. You're a gang member. No, I'm not. Prove it. What? I got to go to court. No, no due process.
Right. And then with all that, of course, we have to talk about updates around Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Because, you know, while he is just one man, he represents a much, much larger situation. The latest update on his situation is that his surroundings are slightly better, at least according to court filings that the government made, because they're required to update the court every few days about Kilmar's situation. And he's now allegedly being held at a lower security prison where he gets his own bed and furniture. Although with that, he was reportedly held in solitary confinement for weeks, which could mean no furnishings at all. With that swap apparently being done before Senator Chris Van Hollen visited him last week, which, speaking of visits, 4 Democratic lawmakers just landed this week in El Salvador to try and get Abrego Garcia out, with Representative Robert Garcia saying, while Donald Trump continues to defy the Supreme Court, Kilmar Abrego Garcia is being held illegally in El Salvador after being wrongfully deported. And adding, this is why we're here, to remind the American people that kidnapping immigrants and deporting them without due process is not how we do things in America. And while you have the State Department saying that Abrego Garcia is in good conditions and in an excellent state of health, these Democrats are demanding daily proof of life. And this is the Salvadoran government rejected their attempts to see him, arguing that they're not in the country in an official capacity. But then finally, with all this, we started talking about Venezuelans being held in El Salvador, and it looks like there might actually be an update on that. Because in a post on X directed to the Venezuelan president, Bukele offered an exchange. 252 Venezuelans who were deported from the US and are being held in El Salvador for the same number of, quote, political prisoners being held in Venezuela. With Bukele listing off the names of journalists, activists, and the family members of high-level opposition figures in Venezuela, as well as accusing the government in Venezuela of detaining nearly 50 citizens of other nationalities, including Americans, and adding, the only reason they are imprisoned is for having opposed you in your electoral fraud. But then, in response, the prosecutor's office in Venezuela responding by calling Bukele a neo-fascist and saying that his comments were, quote, cynical, with them then demanding information about the people that the Salvadoran government has detained, including their legal status and medical reports. In their statement, it came in hot, saying, the treatment received by Venezuelans in the United States and El Salvador constitutes a serious violation of international human rights law and constitutes a crime against humanity. And with all this, there's still a lot of uncertainty around the specifics of Bukele's proposed swap, with a big question being, are the political prisoners going to be free upon getting to El Salvador? And so ultimately, there's a lot that we're gonna have to keep our eyes on several different fronts, but if there is just one place I can end is, how the fuck are we debating about if due process should exist? That's genuinely fucking insane. The people that are rooting for this are either not thinking about it or they love autocratic, fascist, dictator bullshit, but they don't like those words. And I find myself agreeing with Senator Chris Van Hollen when he says he is not vouching for Abrego Garcia. He's not vouching for the man. He is vouching for his constitutional rights to due process in America. If we live in a world where the government can just say you are this thing or you're guilty of this thing and you do not get a chance at due process, that's beyond fuck. And as you see repeated in history over and over again, it starts with someone that the general citizenry could go, oh, well, those are other people, distant people. This could never happen to me and my friends and my family. I mean, we're so different. But Joe Rogan is right in this avenue. One day, the people that you want in power may not be in power. Or what if you just end up being on the wrong side of the people currently in power because shit changes? Maybe that Bulls jersey you wear, and it's not because you think MJ is the GOAT, it's because you're a member of MS-13. Maybe that fucked up joke you said, it wasn't a joke, it was a serious thing, and actually it was a threat. Who's to say, really? Not you, because fuck due process. And as is often the case, if you don't stand up for the rights of those that you aren't aligned with or you actively disagree with, you don't actually stand for anything except power and control.